Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
So Jennifer's case, the Jennifer Bastian case, and to some extent Michelle Welch, they were kind of the common thread throughout this book. So you hear about them at the beginning, you hear little bits and pieces about them throughout the book as I'm talking about other cases that I was investigating during different times of my career, and then you hear about them again at the end. And I think that was a key piece that my agent was really adamant about, is like, we need to tie this whole book together. We don't want just a collection of cases. We want, we need a string that runs through this whole thing, even though we are talking about a variety of different cases, what's going to link them all together. And so that was those two cases. And for me, those were cases that had happened when I was a little girl. So the book starts all the way back in my childhood and up until present day.
Yeah, well, I specifically remember, especially with Cheryl, where you were talking about that's kind of what inspired you to become a detective. And
certainly one of the things, yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because if anybody asked me, I would always say, if someone would ask me, why did I become a detective? I would always say, oh, it was Ted Bundy. I was reading about Ted Bundy. And actually, my next door neighbor, she just finished reading my book, and she had something interesting to say, which I hadn't ever really thought about. But there were things that I talk about in the book that happened that were very critical things that occurred, or things that really stuck with me, or I would call them like seminal moments that occurred in three different stages of my life, as in three different developmental stages. So, childhood, pre-adolescence, and then adolescence. And, how does that play into making that kind of an impact? I had never even thought about that. It didn't even occur to me. But, maybe that's something that was a driving force for me that I could never even articulate or didn't really understand, if that makes sense.
Wow. Well, let's get the psychology couch out, and we can discuss the intimate relationships at different stages of Lindsey Wade's life here.
Yeah. Exactly.
No, that's awesome. Well, and I know, again, in the previous conversations that we've had, where you were talking about those two little girls that were killed in the parks. And how old were you when that happened?
I was 10 and 11.
Okay, so you were about the same age as those girls. And yeah, I'm sure you had ridden your bike through those parks and through or similar places. And, back when we were kids, it's like, that kind of stuff just never, at least you didn't hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
And especially like on a regular basis. And so when you're growing up in a small community, really, and not necessarily a small community, but and a community that's intimate enough where most people know each other, you definitely know all your neighbors. There's not so many people piled on top of each other that it's just impossible to really not get to know a lot of people. You see the same people over and over. And you compare that to today, and, even neighborhoods that used to be fairly spread out and I don't want to say sparse, but at the same time, now it's like my community. Well, for example, my community here in Utah, it's like, they can't build the houses fast enough. It's just exploding. And I'm sure Tacoma's the same way and has been for years. And so, everything changes, and I understand that. But at the same time, as communities and things change, the general feeling of that community changes as well. And
Right.
So when you're thinking about how something dramatic like that can happen back when you were a kid, and the impact, it's got such a major impact on your entire life, it makes sense that thread would go through all the cases that you ever worked.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's brilliant. So, kudos to your writing and your publisher.
Yeah.
I mean, they sound like pretty smart people. So,
Yeah. Well, and it's just those were cases that were always in the back of my mind. And so, I talk about in the book how I might have been investigating a specific case, but, in the back of my mind, I would always be asking myself, depending on the circumstances, like, oh, could this be the guy? Like, could this be the guy for, Jennifer and Michelle's cases? So, they were just, I mean, I hate to say that I always had kind of like a mental set of sticky notes in my brain for, different cases that were unsolved. But these two for sure were cases like that, where if I would hear about something happening, if I would be, investigating a case, I would always, again, kind of wonder like, I wonder if this guy could be good for one of these cases. And for the longest time, it was good for both of these cases, because for the longest, we thought it was the same guy.
Well, let's look at a few of these cases then.
Yeah.
Anyone in particular that you want to highlight?
Well, I think one that's interesting, and one that it hits on a topic that a lot of people are unaware of. That is the, lack of DNA profiles in the CODIS database. And this case really highlights that problem. And this is not a Washington State problem. This is a national issue. Over the past, I don't know, probably 7-8 years now, a lot of states have come to recognize that we have serious problems. We've got huge gaps in our databases, and we've got convicted murderers and rapists that should be in the DNA database, and they're not there for a variety of reasons. And a lot of these guys are individuals who were convicted prior to a DNA law taking effect, right? So they're kind of forgotten about because they got convicted back in the 70s or the 80s, really during the golden age of serial killing. And since they were already locked up by the time somebody passed a DNA law in the 90s, nobody really thought maybe we should include these people. Some of these states passed laws and they were not retroactive. So they literally could not collect from these people even if they wanted to. And then there's other states that just basically ignored the people that were, in custody for long. Some of these people died in prison, got executed, died on death row. Some of these people are still in prison today and have been in prison serving life sentences or huge sentences and have never had their DNA collected. So,
Sorry to interrupt, but I find that really interesting because, the stats of recidivism and the number of criminals that are out there causing the majority of crime. For example, I've heard the stat that New York City, for example, the majority of the crime I'm pretty sure is New York. It's either New York or Chicago. They were saying there's about 600 people that are doing the majority of the major crime in like these major cities.
mm-hmm.
It's not a huge number. So,
Right.
When you do catch one of these, say it's a serial killer, but you don't know that it's usually a he. If you don't know that he is an actual serial killer, you think he's just one of the guys that killed a particular victim.
Right.
And then, but if you don't collect his DNA, then some of these, how many other cases could have never been solved?
Right.
Boy, that
Yeah.
needs to be fixed.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, you can, if you, I was just working on putting together some different cases as examples. And, there are quite a few cases around the country where this has happened. And, law enforcement is spending time and resources investigating these cases to no end. The families are wondering what's going on and why no progress is being made. Some of these cases have been solved using investigative genetic genealogy, which, that's a great tool. But if the case should have been solved already years earlier, just with a simple CODIS hit, then is that really a good use of time and resources?
Oh, right. Yeah.
You know,
I was just at a investigative, a genealogical DNA conference down in San Diego, and it's just amazing that the interest level in that is incredibly high. But I think the same amount of emphasis that's on this genealogical DNA, granted that's the latest and greatest, so everybody's really excited about it, especially since the GSK was solved with that. But I think you're really onto something there, where you say, you know what, all we got to do is make sure that everybody that's in prison for a felony is in the CODIS database, and how many, it's hard to speculate, but who knows how many of those, say the last I've heard is there's 250,000 homicide cold cases.
Right.
230 to 250,000.
Right.
How many of those do you think possibly could be solved?
Yeah. And the reality is most law enforcement agencies don't have the resources, certainly don't have the money to utilize investigative genetic genealogy. And, CODIS is free. CODIS is run by your state crime lab. So, we have the system in place. We just need to use it.
Yeah.
And one of the big gaps in modern day gaps where people are being missed are people who get credit for time served and they never go to prison. So maybe they take a plea agreement and they bump their crime down, or maybe they already did time in jail while they were awaiting, either trial or a plea date. And so they get credit for that time they already served and they get released, and they never go anywhere to have their DNA taken. And it's up for debate about who should collect the DNA. But if you're not in a arrestee state, then I believe the DNA needs to be collected in the courtroom before you leave at the time of sentencing, because in a lot of jurisdictions, they're basically using the honor system. So somebody gets convicted of a qualifying offense where they owe DNA, and they're ordered by the judge to provide a DNA sample, but they walk out of the courthouse and they're told, oh, stop by the jail on your way out, or stop by room 102 on your way out and give your DNA. And how many people actually do it? Not very many. And there's no verification process. There's no way to ensure that those people actually abide by those orders. And
how ironic is that you have criminals, you're saying, you're on the honor system to go down and give your DNA, and they're just like, what? Screw that.
Right. And, the other issue with lawfully owed DNA is that, I guess, common sense might make you say, well, we should really address the people that are convicted of rapes and murders, because those are the people that are probably going to hit to the cold cases. That's actually not true. If you look at statistics and you look at statistics on CODIS hits, the majority of people who hit to a homicide or a sexual assault case, their DNA was collected as the result of a non-violent qualifying offense, usually a drug case, a burglary, or some other property crime. Those are the reasons people's DNA is being collected and put into CODIS. They are hitting to the rapes and homicides.
And why do you think that is?
Well, because, criminals don't just operate in a vacuum. They commit all kinds of crimes. There's a spectrum, and you're much more likely to get caught for a burglary or some kind of property crime or a drug possession charge than you are for committing a violent crime. And they're more prolific. You might commit, the property crime 100 times, but you might only commit the sexual assault once or twice, or the homicide, once. You know what I'm saying? So there's more opportunity to get caught, I think, for those property crimes.
Yeah. Well, we can go round and round with this, but I find it amazing that we create all these laws, and then for one reason or another, a lot of them just aren't even, we don't even uphold them. And we definitely don't prosecute them the way we should. And the worst part about it is the recurring victims. For example, here in Utah, there was a crime scene investigator that was telling me that they had caught a guy that had committed a rape, and they took his DNA and they submitted it. Now, in order to get that match with the actual rape, you have to have a reference sample, and that reference sample they submitted to the lab, and it took 9 months to get the results back. Well, in that 9 months, this guy had gone out and committed 3 more
Mm.
rapes. And so if you were one of those additional 3
Right.
rapes, how would you feel when you're like, they caught this guy?
Right.
Why did it take so long
Mhm.
to get the match back and get him off the street? Because like you said, these guys, if they're committing one crime, then more than likely they're committing
Yeah.
more. And a lot of times they can be more heinous than what they're actually caught for.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
But we definitely need to get more resources, and sadly, it seems that one of the first places that politicians look to cut, to match their budget, they cut it from law enforcement and from critical services like the crime lab.
Yeah. Which is really unfortunate. The case that I talk about in the book was a case that addresses this very issue, and this was one of the cases that I really stumbled across, I would say, early on, where I first started to recognize this is actually an issue, this issue of these, really bad guys that are not in the database. Because, myself as a detective, prior to this, I assumed that, if you went to prison, you're a convicted rapist, you're a level 3 sex offender, you're a serial killer, of course your DNA is in the database. Isn't that why we have a database? And then, I quickly learned that's not always the case. And so this was a situation where I was actually investigating a cold case back in 2011. And I was speaking to someone at our State Department of Corrections about this particular case I was working on. And we were discussing our sexually violent predator island. So we have an island in Washington State where there is a place called the Special Commitment Center, and it houses, I don't know how many out there currently, but I think since it opened, they've had over 400 people be committed there, and they are called sexually violent predators, and these are individuals that have committed usually multiple sex crimes. They're deemed too dangerous to be released. The state basically files a case against them, a sexually violent predator case, and it's a civil process. And if they're found to meet the standard or the criteria as a sexually violent predator, they're detained out at this facility indefinitely. And we started talking about the population out there at McNeil Island, and I asked the question, is everybody out there at McNeil in CODIS? Because, I was thinking it's kind of a dumb question to even ask, right? Like, these are the worst sex offenders in our state. They're too dangerous to be released into the community after serving their prison sentence. I'm probably stupid to even ask this question. And the response I got was, not sure about that. We'll look into it. And then I quickly learned that there were over 40 sexually violent predators out at this island who had never provided a DNA sample. And some of them had been out there since the early 1990s when the place opened. So that was really eye-opening to me. But also it kind of lit a fire under me, because I'm like, holy crap. These guys, and I would start reading their histories and reading while they were, why they were there, and looking up their convictions. And it was horrifying when I would, read through what they had done and what their histories would look like. And so I'm thinking, well, we have to be sitting on a gold mine out here, because these guys are probably responsible for some cold cases.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.